The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress is one of the most legendary aircraft ever built. More than just a heavy bomber, it became a symbol of American resolve, engineering might, and aerial supremacy during the most devastating conflict in human history, World War II. But to understand the full impact of the B-17, we have to start long before the war, in the uneasy years between the First and Second World Wars. In the early 1930s, the U.S. Army Air Corps realized it needed a new generation of bombers, aircraft that could fly farther, carry more bombs, and defend themselves over hostile territory. At the time, military aviation was still considered a novelty. Biplanes were giving way to monoplanes. Radio communication was primitive. Navigation often relied on dead reckoning. But some visionaries believed the future of warfare would belong to those who controlled the skies. And one of the central ideas gaining traction was that a well defended bomber, flying high and fast, could reach enemy targets without the need for escort fighters. This idea became known as the bomber will always get through. It was an optimistic and ultimately flawed theory, but it would shape the B 17's design from the beginning. In 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a request for a multi engine bomber capable of flying at least 2,000 miles at 200 miles per hour while carrying a bomb load of 2,000 pounds. Several companies responded, but Boeing's Model 299 prototype captured everyone's attention. It was sleek, fast, and heavily armed. When it first flew on July 28, 1935, it immediately impressed observers. Tragically, that prototype crashed during testing due to a locked elevator control, killing the pilot and raising serious concerns. But Boeing's design had shown so much promise that the Air Corps decided to fund a small batch for further evaluation. The name Flying Fortress came from a newspaper reporter who, seeing the number of machine guns bristling from the prototype's windows, said it looked like a fortress in the sky. Boeing quickly adopted the name, and the legend began. The production model, designated the B 17B, entered service in 1939. Over the next several years, as tensions in Europe escalated and war broke out, the B 17 would go through rapid development. Each variant added more armor, more firepower, and more survivability. By the time the B 17G rolled off the production line, the most famous version, it had 13.50 caliber machine guns, including a remote controlled chin turret to defend against head on attacks. Powered by four Wright R1 820 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, the B 17 could reach altitudes over 30,000 feet and had a top speed of nearly 300 miles per hour. Its standard bomb load was 4,000 to 5,000 pounds, but it could carry up to 8,000 pounds on shorter missions. More importantly, it could absorb damage and keep flying. There are countless stories of B 17s returning to base with half their tail blown off, engines missing, and fuselages shredded by flak and bullets, yet they kept flying. This durability was no accident. The B 17's designers built in redundancy and structural integrity that few other aircraft could match. It became clear early in the war that this bomber would not just be a tool, it would become a symbol. When the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the B 17 was already in production, but it was in the skies over Europe where the Flying Fortress would truly make its mark. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in England, began deploying B 17s in large formations to carry out daylight bombing raids over Nazi occupied territory. These missions targeted aircraft factories, oil refineries, U boat pens, and ball bearing plants, all vital to the German war effort. The theory was that tightly packed bomber formations could provide mutual defense, laying down walls of overlapping .50 caliber fire from their gun positions. Nose gunners, tail gunners, waist gunners, top turret gunners, and ball turret gunners would all work in unison to repel enemy fighters. And in the early days, those fighters came in droves. German Messerschmitt Bf-19s, Focke-Wulf FW-19s, and others would swarm the formations. Losses were brutal. The missions were long, often 8 to 10 hours, and the sky was filled with danger. Anti-aircraft artillery, known as flak, burst all around the bombers at altitude. Flak shrapnel ripped through wings, engines, and crew compartments. Fighters dove in with machine guns and cannons, exploiting blind spots and making attack runs at incredible speed. But the B 17s held their formation. They kept flying. Crews endured frostbite, oxygen deprivation, and sheer terror. Temperatures at altitude dropped to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen masks sometimes froze. Gunners wore heated flight suits, though these too often failed. If a plane was hit and broke formation, it became a sitting duck, isolated, vulnerable, and often doomed. Yet, despite the danger, thousands of young American men climbed aboard these bombers and flew mission after mission. They believed in the strategy. They believed that if they could cripple Germany's industrial base, they could shorten the war. And they believed in the flying fortress. The aircraft became a lifeline, a battered shield in the sky that brought them home time and again. One of the most famous B 17s of the war was the Memphis Belle. Named after the pilot's sweetheart and decorated with nose art that became iconic, the Belle was among the first B 17 to complete 25 combat missions with its crew intact, a major milestone at the time. The U.S. government brought the aircraft and its crew back to the States to help promote war bonds and morale. The Memphis Belle became a legend, and its story was told in books and later in Hollywood films. But for every Memphis Belle, there were hundreds of B 17s that never came home. Some were lost over the North Sea, others crashed in occupied France or Germany. Many went down in flames after taking direct hits from flak or fighters. Thousands of airmen were killed or taken prisoner. The casualty rates for bomber crews were among the highest in the war, yet the B 17 kept flying. Its mission continued. By mid 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force had committed fully to the doctrine of daylight precision bombing using the B 17 Flying Fortress. The strategy was bold and dangerous. Strike at the heart of Germany's war machine during daylight hours with formations of unescorted bombers. The goal was to cripple the enemy's industrial capacity and force them to surrender through sheer attrition. But as the missions became more ambitious and the targets more distant, the cost grew staggering. One of the most infamous missions of the war took place on August 17th, 1943, the Schweinfurt Regensburg raid. This mission involved over 370 B 17s flying a two pronged attack. The Regensburg group would strike aircraft factories and then continue on to North Africa. The Schweinfurt group would target ball bearing plants and return to England. The operation was meant to divide German fighter response and deliver a strategic knockout blow. But coordination between the two wings failed, and the Schweinfurt group bore the brunt of the German resistance. What followed was a slaughter. Over 60 bombers were lost in a single day. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured. And while the raid did damage important factories, it did not cripple them. Germany recovered production within weeks. The loss rate, nearly 16%, was unsustainable. But instead of abandoning the campaign, the U.S. doubled down. The belief was that the only way to win was to keep pressing. In October of that same year, the 8th Air Force launched another raid on Schweinfurt. This time, 291 B 17s took off. 60 didn't come back. Nearly 600 men were lost in a single day. It became known as Black Thursday. Morale among bomber crews plummeted. The belief that formations of flying fortresses could protect themselves without fighter escort was shattered. The Luftwaffe had adapted. German fighters like the FW-190s had been fitted with heavy cannons and rockets. They could blast through a formation and rip open a B-17 in seconds. The German defense network included radar, flak towers, and coordinated response teams. Every time the bombers came, they were met with brutal resistance. The crew of a B 17 faced danger from the moment the engine started. Takeoff could be chaotic. Flying in tight formation required precision flying at all times. Once they reached altitude, the temperature dropped. Oxygen masks were mandatory above 10,000 feet. Each gunner had to monitor their station while scanning the sky for fighters. The ball turret gunner, crammed beneath the belly of the aircraft, was especially vulnerable. Surrounded by plexiglass and isolated from the crew, he had little room to move, but his role was critical in defending against underbelly attacks. Waist gunners stood at open windows exposed to the freezing air. The top turret covered the high approach, while the tail gunner kept watch over their six. Each position was vital, and then came the flak. Anti-aircraft bursts filled the sky with black smoke and lethal fragments of steel. It wasn't the direct hits that always killed. It was the shrapnel that sliced through wings, fuel tanks, and crew compartments. Pilots flew through it, unable to maneuver. Deviating from formation made you a target, so you flew straight, and you hoped, and still they went back. Day after day, week after week, every mission counted. Every bomb dropped was another chance to shorten the war. In early 1944, things began to change. The P 51 Mustang arrived, a long range escort fighter that could finally fly with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Suddenly, the balance shifted. With fighter cover, B 17 losses dropped. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin from years of combat, began to suffer. Fighter aces were killed, fuel supplies dwindled. German aircraft production, already hit by earlier raids, now faced continuous pressure. Missions over Berlin tested the limits of the bombers and their crews. The skies over the German capital were thick with flak. Smoke from burning cities created black clouds that hid fighters and obscured targets. Yet the B-17s kept coming. They bombed rail yards, factories, military depots, and though accuracy was never perfect, especially in poor weather, the damage added up. By mid 1944, Germany's ability to replace aircraft, tanks, and weapons was falling behind. In one raid on March 6, 1944, over 800 B 17s struck Berlin with full fighter escort. Dozens of German aircraft were lost. The damage to war infrastructure was immense. These missions didn't just disrupt industry, they disrupted morale. Civilians fled cities. Production was scattered into underground factories and forests. Hitler's command structure grew more paranoid. Meanwhile, Allied airmen were fighting a war of attrition, not just with the enemy, but with time. Completing 25 missions was the goal. After that, a crew could rotate home. But the odds were brutal. In 1943, some units faced over 70% loss rates before reaching that milestone. Crews developed rituals. Some carried lucky charms. Others wrote letters before every mission. Pilots and gunners became brothers, bonded by fire and fear. They slept in shared bunks, attended briefings shoulder to shoulder, and watched friends vanish over the North Sea or disappear into black smoke above Germany, and still they flew. Not because they were fearless, but because they believed they were making a difference. And they were. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a dominant force. Allied fighters ruled the skies. German cities were under constant bombardment. The B-17 Flying Fortress had proven its worth, not as an invincible weapon, but as a reliable workhorse, a deadly tool, a machine that with its crew could bring destruction deep into enemy territory and come home again, sometimes barely. As 1945 began, the tide of war had fully turned. Germany was in retreat. Its industrial base had been decimated. Its cities were in ruins, and the skies over Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. They belonged to the Allies. B-17 missions continued deep into the heart of the Reich. Oil refineries, communication hubs, and transportation networks were the primary targets now. Without fuel and without railways, Germany's ability to wage war crumbled. In one of the last major raids, over 1,400 B-17s and their fighter escorts struck Berlin in February of 1945, demolishing rail yards and munitions plants. Resistance was lighter than it had been a year earlier. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend its airspace effectively. Flak still claimed bombers, but the losses were fewer and the missions were relentless. Crews who had once feared reaching mission number 10 were now seeing their way to mission 25 and beyond. In the final months, B 17s shifted toward tactical targets, troop concentrations, bridges, and enemy supply routes. They flew lower, dropped more precise payloads, and supported the Allied ground advance as it closed in on Berlin. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Victory had been hard won, and the price paid by B 17 crews was immense. Over 12,000 B 17s were built during the war. More than 4,700 were lost in combat. Tens of thousands of airmen never came home. Others came home changed by the noise, by the fear, by the friends they left behind. The legacy of the B 17 wasn't just in its numbers, it was in the fact that it had become a symbol of resilience, of sacrifice, of strength. But the B 17 service didn't end with the fall of Nazi Germany. Thousands of these aircraft remained operational. Some were refitted, repurposed, and deployed to the Pacific Theater. There, the B-17 was less prominent, eclipsed by the larger, longer-range B-29 Super Fortress. Still, B-17s played key roles in maritime patrol, anti-submarine missions, and search and rescue operations. They were used to spot enemy ships, escort convoys, and drop supplies to stranded personnel. In the opening stages of the Pacific War, particularly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, B-17s had already proven their worth. Though limited in number and range, they struck Japanese shipping lanes, bombed enemy airfields, and helped hold the line in the Philippines and Australia. Their ruggedness served them well in the heat and humidity of the Pacific. But by late 1944, their time in frontline bombing roles had ended. The future belonged to the B 29. After the war, hundreds of B-17s were flown back to the United States. Some were sold for scrap, others were parked in the desert, stored in rows under the open sky. A few were used in nuclear tests, a handful were converted into transport aircraft, some became firefighting bombers, dropping water and retardant over forest fires, but many, heartbreakingly, were cut into pieces and forgotten. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that serious efforts to preserve surviving B-17s began. Museums, veterans groups, and aviation enthusiasts scrambled to find remaining aircraft. Some were found in hangars, others were recovered from crash sites and painstakingly restored. Today, fewer than 50 B-17s remain intact around the world. Only a handful are still airworthy. Each one is considered a national treasure. The most famous of them all is likely the Memphis Belle. After decades exposed to the elements and multiple restoration attempts, it now resides in the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, fully restored and displayed with honor. Others, like Sentimental Journey, Texas Raiders, and 909, flew for decades in air shows and tours, carrying the stories of their crews to new generations. Tragically, 909 was lost in a crash in 2019, a stark reminder of the risks involved in flying these aging giants. Yet the effort continues. Volunteers and experts across the world maintain and fly B-17s not just as aircraft, but as living history. Every rivet, every seat, every turret tells a story. They are not just planes, they are monuments. The B-17 has also carved out a permanent place in popular culture. Hollywood has told its story time and again. From the 1944 documentary The Memphis Belle, a story of a flying fortress, to the 1990 feature film Memphis Belle, to dozens of documentaries and docuseries, the image of the flying fortress endures. It appears in books, in comics, in art. It's a staple in flight simulator games, a symbol of power and purpose. One reason the B-17 has such a lasting legacy is because it represents more than combat. It represents teamwork. Each bomber had a crew of 10 men whose lives depended on one another. The pilot and co pilot had to fly tight formations, respond to flak damage, and make life or death decisions. The navigator plotted courses through skies filled with death. The bombardier was responsible for dropping the payload, timing it perfectly while the aircraft flew straight into enemy fire. Gunners scanned the skies, tracking enemy fighters, shouting warnings, and holding down triggers with frozen hands. The radio operator relayed position, damage reports, and weather warnings. Each man had a job. Each man was essential. The B-17 didn't just carry bombs, it carried men. Young men, some barely old enough to vote. They climbed aboard knowing the odds, and they climbed aboard anyway. What they did, what they endured, and what they achieved is etched into history. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress is more than an aircraft. It's a story, a chapter in the fight for freedom, a machine that came to represent determination in the face of overwhelming odds. And long after the last mission was flown, the sound of those four radial engines and roaring across the sky still reminds us of what it took to win the air war. It wasn't just firepower, it was courage, it was brotherhood, it was the flying fortress.